We're gonna go ahead and get started. Because we're using one laptop, you're gonna see me bouncing back and forth between the chat, the notes that Marty has for in support of the presentation with the links and everything. So just bear with me on that. And but other than that, I do want to just for some quick housekeeping, we've got several events coming up. There's a collaborative event with Cloud Security Alliance and ISSA San Diego. Tuesday at the KPMG offices. That's coming up. We have a booth at the Science and Technology Fair on March 1st, which will be at Petco Park, if anybody's familiar with that. It's a very family-friendly event with a lot of different participants. They were nice enough to give us a table, so we'll be hanging out at that. On March 5th, there's going to be one of the cybersecurity social mixers at AleSmith Brewery. If you go to, and I'll drop the link in the chat, but the chapter's website is ISACA-SD.org. And if you go there under events, you'll see a page for each event where you can go get more info and be able to register from there. And all of these events are open to the public at no cost as well. I have huge thank yous for Marty, the good looking one here. It was the end of last year, we found out that we couldn't be at National University. We did January online and shot a note out of who could be able to potentially adopt us for a bit. And Marty made the room available. It's been fantastic so far. That's where you're seeing a bit of the logistics kind of getting ironed out here. But other than that, anybody online, questions, please drop them in the chat. You'll see them in real time up on the screen. So Marty can answer them and put them there. Other than that, I'll hand it over to you, but a huge thank you for everything.
Well, welcome everybody. Welcome to XiFin. We've been in business in San Diego for 27 years now. We provide medical billing software and services. We have about, well, over 1,000 employees. So we're growing quickly and cybersecurity is really obviously an important part of our life. And I have the pleasure of being both our CISO and our Chief Legal Officer. And so you're getting a different perspective on cybersecurity because today's discussion is going to be talking about how the public and top-down boards and other stakeholders are looking at cybersecurity, because it's different than how we as cybersecurity professionals look at cybersecurity. And for careers in cybersecurity, this is an important dimension that will help you think about the interests of stakeholders that you might not otherwise be thinking of, and how that should color how you present things, what you think about, and what pressures are going to be brought on all of you as cybersecurity professionals. I have my CRISC and my CISM from ISACA. I also am on the Emerging Trends Working Group for ISACA. I think it's a great organization and extremely pragmatic. I encourage you to participate, to look at all the materials that come out. I think they're very useful and very helpful in a cybersecurity career. So thank you all for coming. We're really glad to be able to help and support this. And please ask questions. This is a collaborative thing. I'm just showing you a dimension and a perspective that I think is important. So questions, points, whatever will be great. And thank you for everybody out there in the world who's listening to us. And please put into the chat any questions. And Dave, if there's something that pops up that I can't see, please let me know.
Awesome.
Okay. So first, what is ESG? ESG is an acronym that stands for environmental. Okay, so some and the rest of you will learn because even in today's world, it is an important aspect of our lives and parts of the world very significant and required. So it stands for environmental, social, and governance. And it's a set of criteria that we use to look at how organization is impacting other stakeholders, the public and specific stakeholders other than shareholders. Typically, a corporation operates itself to generate profits for shareholders. And this is looking at the rest of the world and how they're impacted by an organization's activities. So the first question, does your organization have an ESG program? And Dave, if you could page down just a little bit. Yeah. Super. So yes, no, or you don't know. For the people in the room, raise your hands if you know that you have an ESG program. So just a few. Okay. How many don't know? See, and that's really interesting, right? Because the point of ESG is to let everybody in the organization know that the company is committed to certain aspects of its operation that we're going to talk about in a second. So the history of ESG starts in the mid 1900s. By the 50s, you had a discussion going on about how companies need to do more than just maximize profit. At the time, a fairly revolutionary concept. And there was a famous book, Social Responsibilities of the Businessman, because back then business was just for men. That really started looking at corporate accountability as something that needed to be considered. The term ESG was first used in 2004 in a United Nations paper, and I've given links to all of these things. I don't know if this presentation is available to people.
Yeah, I'm sorry, it will be. We are recording, so we can share the video.
Right.
And with the video, we'll have a copy of this Word doc available that will be available to everybody.
Excellent. I tried to put in some useful links that let you do whatever research you want to understand this. So if we scroll down just a little bit more.
Yeah, sure. And God willing, we'll get it up over the weekend.
Great. So this excerpt is a quote from that UN publication, Who Cares Wins. And the idea was that 20 leading global financial institutions, so investment banks and the like, weighed in and said the environmental, social, and governance issues matter, not just for the public concerns, but even for the value in the long term of a corporation. So you had that put front and center, that both for public citizenship reasons, but also even for the long-term value of a company, this aspect and this focus matters. So since then, what you've had is much like cybersecurity. We operate by starting with frameworks and looking at frameworks to give us the basic structure of how to organize our efforts. ESG is the same thing, and there has been an explosion of frameworks. It hasn't really settled down the way cybersecurity has, that in the US, for example, most people start with NIST and move on from that. With ESG, we're not at the point yet where there is a generally accepted ESG framework, and we're going to talk about that more in a little while. So ESG factors have become more and more important to investors, to shareholders and other stakeholders, and most importantly to the public. So a little bit.
You say that it's at that state of maturity or lack of, that's international.
It is. That's a great point, Dave, that there are probably around 20 frameworks that are bandied about for ESG. And around the world, there is not a general acceptance. You know, if you say ISO is what the start is in Europe and NIST is the start in the US, there's nothing like that because it's still a very broad set of characteristics. And we'll discuss what those are in a second, because it's still something that when a company prepares its ESG program, you wind up picking from many different frameworks.
Gotcha. Okay. Thank you.
Yep. So the factors, again, help us, ESG factors help us in understanding how a company is managing risks and opportunities for these public concerns, sustainability, social impact and benefit, and governance. And while governance has typically been the province of lawyers and corporate law, we're now looking at governance more like cybersecurity people do in terms of how the company actually operates on a daily basis and the impact that those activities have on those around the company. So a little bit further. In the US, you've probably read, there is a lot of debate about ESG. And even in today's political environment, while there have been some cutbacks, it is still very relevant, and we're going to go through why. But in the rest of the world, in Europe, for example, there's a series of legal requirements that have not been carved back. And so for those of us who do business in Europe, you have direct requirements. For those of us with customers in Europe, they have to flow those requirements down to us. So the US is now only one part of a global framework of regulation. And this is one area that's really impacted by that. So we have a great quote there about the regulatory divergence and key trends, both in the US and outside. And that's one that I would encourage people to click on because it gives you a snapshot of the current state of laws around the world, because that is driving a lot of this. How many people currently get involved in ESG activities in their company? Interestingly, just one. Okay.
Sorry, I was speaking with Lucy on time. How many raised your hands on questions? We're going from 6 to 1.
Yeah, and that's quite interesting. And I don't know for the people participating remotely, it will be interesting to see their answers as well.
Is governance in this context referring to governance of the environmental and social programs, or is it referring to like a general corporate governance system? And probably I was with that in 20 years, we sort of like together what governance was.
Huh.
So we had, but we were small. So nobody there. But we had environmental, we had social programs, and IT that I ran was also part of governance. So
Yes. And so that is how it's broken down. People generally will manage ESG as a single function, but the G part of it is cybersecurity, IT, the operations of the organization. Environmental is really separate, and we're going to break it down in a few minutes, but they are three separate concepts that come together in an overall corporate and social view of the company.
So yeah, G.
Say that again?
That's a great question. Yeah, is the G and GRC the same thing as the G and ESG? I think the ESG is broader because it's going to be looking at any operations of the company that can impact third parties. So a little bit farther down. So I give a few links on the legal and regulatory sources of ESG obligations. And this is a big driver that isn't going away. We may have a step back from some of the US regulations, but not in the rest of the world. And in fact, I expect the rest of the world to react the other way, kind of like have they've done with privacy. US privacy laws have not been as rigorous as the rest of the world. And the GDPR had a great impact, as I'm sure you're all aware, around the rest of the world in upping the privacy approaches. So now you have Brazil, Japan, South Korea, Australia have very rigorous privacy laws patterned after the GDPR, as now is the California CPA. So I expect the same thing to happen with ESG. In Europe, it's not going away. And I give you some discussion here about the European Union and the countries underneath it. So there's several reporting obligations in the EU. So large companies, and large now keeps getting smaller as they legislate and drive these requirements down into the European corporate environment. And so you have quite a number of laws that require reporting. And if you fail to report, that has its own consequences. And the way the EU works is similar to the way the US works. You have union-wide laws and regulations, but then each country is entitled to pass its own laws as long as they don't conflict. And so Germany in particular recently adopted a supply chain due diligence act that flows down a lot of these social obligations onto companies. And if you're a contractor to a German company, they're going to have to flow these down to you, even if you're in the US. Yeah, so it's going to become more and more complicated, just like the rest of regulation is for American
And
companies.
that's how you see it trickling in.
In one way, I'm going to share with you all in a second other ways that it can impact, because I'm going to use XiFin as an example of the different ways that we wind up subject to these requirements.
You know, that ESG is sort of applying to the rest of the world. Right? So is that the case then that cybersecurity as it affects the rest of the world?
Yeah, it's a good question. The question is basically to clarify the obligations for ESG, how they relate to cybersecurity in the US. And I'll give you this context in a second. The cybersecurity laws in the United States are separate, and those are in place. So we all understand.
Oh, thank you for.
Yeah, no, and we know that. So it's just easier. I'll repeat the question so that everybody can hear it. So cybersecurity requirements in the United States are sectoral, right? We understand that you have federal laws like HIPAA or the FTC Act. You have regulations that are promulgated by agencies. And then you have state laws like the California CPA. You have cybersecurity specific laws in Texas and Massachusetts, biometric laws like Illinois law. You have more and more artificial intelligence laws coming up now. So the US generally regulates sectorally, whereas the rest of the world, the GDPR applies generally to everything. So ESG in and of itself in the US is not setting legal requirements for cybersecurity, but it is setting disclosure requirements. The SEC has that requirement as a regulation. And so publicly traded companies in the United States have to report their cybersecurity efforts. And if they're not taking adequate efforts, they're obligated to report that. So they're not going to, and that's creates the legal pressure inside publicly traded companies on cybersecurity. So while not denominated in ESG law in the US, it is still a public reporting requirement for cybersecurity issues.
I have a question.
Sure.
Even though it's a requirement, if there's no enforcement and the requirement doesn't mean a whole lot, do you feel like the enforcement is there to really put that pressure on companies?
Well, let me finish the framework. So the question was, if there aren't laws in the United States that specifically require it, is it something that really impacts us? And so we're going to table that for a second. I'm going to finish giving you the context and then show you that, yes, in fact, this is something that the pressure is going to be more and more on cybersecurity professionals, because once we frame what ESG is in terms of doctrine, we're going to see that in the US, there are still a lot of factors that, while they may not be referred to all the time as ESG, they still collectively result in guidance and direction being brought onto the cybersecurity function. So the SEC first has a climate disclosure rule. California has its own climate disclosure rules for large companies. We're not subject to it. We're not big enough. It has to be very big companies. But state laws, are not going to be impacted the same way that federal laws are by the current environment. And certainly California is not going to back off of its legal requirements.
When you say big enough, just roughly,
I believe that the California requirements, it's a very large revenue. Is it 500 million? I don't remember,
Okay,
but it's
yeah.
very big.
got it,
Yeah.
okay.
So a little bit
Scroll
further,
down.
please. Yep. So one of the very biggest impacts for public companies on cybersecurity is the SEC disclosure rules, which require two things. First, a public company has to report on its cybersecurity protection efforts. And some of those can be several pages in a 10K. And those are scrutinized not just by the SEC, but by shareholders. And if you make a statement in your 10K that isn't true, and then something happens like a breach, and it turns out that your statements about your cybersecurity efforts were not accurate, now there is significant liability. And that liability comes not just from the SEC and fines, but from shareholder suits, because the decrease in shareholder value, they will argue, was driven by your failure to properly disclose that you weren't taking the appropriate measures. And had you, they never would have invested, or they wouldn't have paid that much in the stock. So that is a very significant force of policing the efforts of publicly traded companies in cybersecurity. Aside from laws, there are other sources that can be very significant. So for XiFin, as an example, we contract to provide services to the largest healthcare providers in the country: Walmart, Walgreens, LabCorp, Quest, and they all have contractual obligations that they float to us on ESG. So we have to report to them to show them that we are complying with those obligations that are in the contract. So completely separate from any laws, regulations, just these contract obligations that big companies impose on us as a subcontractor. Then, I'm sure some of you may get involved. We get constant questionnaires, primarily in cybersecurity now. So we have, I would bet that we get about 150 or 200 customers giving us questionnaires every year that require us to provide representations about cybersecurity, resilience, our backups. And while not denominated as a contract document, there's only one reason that you get a questionnaire. It's so that a customer can rely upon it. And if it turns out not to be true, then to sue you on it. Because otherwise they wouldn't need it in writing. So lately we have had those questionnaires expanded to artificial intelligence, and I'm sure you all get involved in those, but we also now get questionnaires that require us to represent our ESG efforts as well. So that's another source of obligation. Doesn't sound like we have one. We fill out a questionnaire and we say, no, we don't do anything. But then our big customer is going to call us and say, if you want to keep doing business with us, here's the things you have to do. We say it's not in the contract, and they say it's okay, the contract's up for renewal in a year, and if you don't do it, we're not going to renew with you. And so there's another pressure that's not legal, and it's not really contractual, and yet it is, in the real world, a pressure to report to them and take certain ESG measures. So I want to make sure that I answer the question, but in our world, which I think is pretty typical, we have laws and regulations, we have our customer pressure, both in contracts and in questionnaires. And then we have one more. We're owned by a private equity fund, very large one. They contract with their shareholders. So their shareholders could be a public employee retirement system. So they've committed by contract with their investors to take certain ESG measures. And as a result, we're audited by an auditing firm every year on our ESG measures to help our owner demonstrate that it's meeting its contract obligations in order to receive the money from its large shareholders. So that's another source of this, and that audit is very extensive for us. It's performed by a European auditing firm, and they take us through all of the aspects, including cybersecurity, which is where I got the idea for this presentation, because they have several pages of questions on our cybersecurity practices. And after they audit us, they grill me for several hours, and then they give us an assessment of what we've done, and they give our owner an assessment so that our board then looks at that and decides if they need to have us do anything more. We have a question. You first.
Assessment or framework, say, we're not.
That's a great question. The question is, the audit that we go through annually, does it drive us to do anything with respect to cybersecurity that we aren't all otherwise doing? Is that the question? And the reason why it doesn't, I'm sorry, I guess I should have also one more source, our cybersecurity insurance. And I'm sure that y'all get involved in that. So for us, we have a 100-page questionnaire that our auditor, our insurance requires that we fill out before the renewal. We take 100 pages, and it drills way down into the details on all of our cybersecurity practices to an extremely granular level, the exact type of encryption we use. So it started off 7 years ago when I started here. Check the box, do you encrypt at rest? Now the encrypt at rest is a paragraph this big. We drill into our secure software development framework compliance and exactly what SAST and DAST testing do we do? How do we protect keys and secrets? And how do we use our repository so that the developers are only using secure versions of whatever? So it really goes down to a very granular level. So in that regard, the only thing that I think the audit does is it pushes us to communicate more, because we're in healthcare. So we get we're high trust certified with R2 high trust for our biggest product. We get a SOC 1, which is the financial compliance. We get a SOC 2. We have a third-party HIPAA assessment. Of course, we do third-party pen tests every year, and we do our own vulnerability testing on a daily basis. So substantively, we didn't have to do anything more, but we do report now more to our customers, to our board, to some of our stakeholders. And in fact, I report monthly to our executive leadership team as CISO. So I have a CISO report, and every month I present to them, and every quarter I report to our audit committee and our full board on cybersecurity issues. So while we didn't have to change a lot because of the ESG audit, it's really because we were already dragged there, either because of our large healthcare customers or because of our other audits that we have and our insurance. Did we have another question? No. Okay.
Okay, so you've got 100-page cybersecurity insurance renewal. You have the annual ESG audit. You have everything else that you listed that I just can't remember the quantity of them. How big is your team?
Yeah, so when I got here, I split things up because of such a burden. So we have a cybersecurity organization that's run by one individual, Mike Conlon. Will works for Mike, and then Will supervises our massive team of 3 people underneath Will. But we do also contract with an MSSP, and then we use a lot of automation. So we aggressively use Splunk, and we feed everything we can into Splunk. We use Archer as our GRC software, and we feed into the GRC system our risk, the things that are identified. So any issues that an audit finds, anything that our teams find, whatever comes up in any way, all goes into Archer so we can manage and prioritize the risk. And that's the cyber side. Then Bill Floater is our SVP of Information Security. And Bill has a team of, I think, 4 people. And so they handle all of our audits. They handle our compliance training, phishing. So we do a phish test for the entire company every month. So every single person gets phished, and then we have a very aggressive notification. Every executive gets notified about anybody who fails it. And when you fail, you're immediately assigned remedial work, and you may be put in internet jail if you keep clicking on it. So we tend to have a lot of work. Bill also manages all of the audits. So right now, what we've done to optimize that is that we've concentrated all of our audits and our insurance in a 3-month period. So May, June, and July, we now do SOC 1, SOC 2, high trust, and our insurance. The only thing we don't do in that window is we're also PCI audited. And for those of you who get involved in PCI, the 4.0 has really changed things because it greatly expanded the footprint that you have to audit. And so we do that in Q4.
Okay. So is it the second group that does the audits and stuff also do the vendor questionnaires?
Yes, they do. That's a great point. So Bill's team handles the several hundred questionnaires that we get, and I unfortunately review each one before it goes out. So I know more about questionnaires than I ever wanted to, and that's why I can speak to how the questionnaires now are changing in the industry and including more ESG functions. And several of our big clients now have separate ESG questionnaires. And the latest, to give you another source of ESG pressure, like a lot of private equity funded companies, we have leverage. We've borrowed money, and our lender has 15 people in ESG. They explained this to me last week, and I get the joy of being audited by them now. And so we will be audited by our lender, to whom we owe a substantial amount of money intentionally, right? That's the leverage that private equity funded companies have. And so to keep our lender happy, we will have an additional set of reports and accountability in ESG.
You batch all your audits up in a 2-month period because of overlap between all the requirements.
Yes, that is.
Use Archer to line them up.
So the question is, why are we bundling all of our audits in a narrow period? And as the questioner suggested, it is to optimize the fact gathering, because you all may understand that when you're going through these audits, the first phase is verifying policies and procedures, but then the second phase is then demonstrating evidence that you're actually really following it and complying with it. And so the evidence gathering we found is a lot more efficient because there's a lot of overlap. We're not getting all the efficiencies that I had hoped for. And this is one big thing in choosing the right security GRC tool, is that a lot of them promise now the one-to-many. You gather a fact once, you can project it onto all of the different control objectives, NIST and SOC and high trust. And it hasn't worked as efficiently as we'd hoped. So we're still trying to solve that and find more efficiencies in gathering the information, and trying to find a system. There's some of them that say they'll continuously gather it so that you don't need to have this big explosion of activity during the 3 months, and it's always documented. We're not there yet.
So you don't have a program.
I'm sorry, ask it again.
Like part of your estate. You know, all the monitoring tools and vulnerability scanning, continuous vulnerability scanning products out there that.
Oh, yeah. So all the operational systems at XiFin are automated and in place. Unfortunately, the answering all the control objectives and the auditor's questions isn't as simple as just using a script to spit out a screenshot or something. There's a lot of follow-up. And for those of you who aren't in the healthcare industry, just the high-tech R2 is about 600 control objectives. And they aren't the same as the SOC 1, which isn't all the same as the SOC 2. And so we wind up with about 1,000 to 1,200 different control objectives and a level of manual work that we're reducing, but we haven't been able to really solve yet. Question in the back.
Yes, for the different audits that you have, like SOC 1, SOC 2, HIPAA, PCI, do you use the same auditor? So the partner in one shop, it will complete all the audits?
That's a great question. Do we use one auditor for all of these audits? And we do. And every year we bundle everything together and negotiate so that we get a very efficient pricing by doing that. And this year we added the CloudStar Alliance to our SOC 2, which is like the questionnaires that we get. Unfortunately, questionnaires are another area where we have not been able to automate because we have about 25 different questionnaires given to us by customers. Some use Sensinet, some use the CSA, some use SIG, some let us off with the SIG Lite. And because they're all different, we haven't been able to automate our answers. But by using one auditor, we do get some more efficiency and we get a inexpensive price as a result. Yep.
Like, are you also passing on questionnaires to your vendors to meet compliance requirements?
Another great question. In the cycle of pain of all of these audits and responsibilities, does it end with us? And the answer is no. Supply chain issues are a very big deal for cybersecurity professionals in general. And if we understand that cybersecurity is one aspect of ESG, the rest of ESG is the same as cybersecurity. You have to worry about your own compliance, but then you got to manage your supply chain. And the supply chain risks, obviously in cybersecurity, are as big or bigger than our internal ones. And in healthcare, they're tragic because it's always that one little vendor that you use as a screening or as a forwarding system or something that winds up having the deficient security standards that are so much worse than yours. So yes, we have to flow down our ESG obligations and we flow down our cybersecurity obligations.
There's CISO and security. Let me know, figure out pollution and air quality is what your thing now.
Yeah, so the question is, I serve as CISO, but since I have the beauty of also running ESG, does that mean I have to worry about all the factors of ESG? And it does. So we don't own any property, we rent, but we have to get statistics from our landlords and we have to calculate the amount of carbon that we consume, the amount of water that we use, the amount of heat we produce. And then we get auditors who tell us that some of it is good practice and some of us needs to be improved. And so then we have to work with our landlords to try and improve it and our subcontractors as well. Okay.
Play into remote workers.
Yeah, good question. So what's the consequence of remote workers on this whole process? And they have to be taken into account. We have quite a number of remote workers, as a lot of billing companies do. And we have multiple offices. We have about 300 people here in San Diego. We have another 100 in Simi Valley. We have a big office in Charleston, South Carolina, and Dallas. And then we have satellite offices in quite a number of other locations. And then in addition, we have a large number of remote workers. And there is just starting to be frameworks and approaches to estimate the impacts that remote workers have. And I don't think it's at a place where we've been able to quantify it. So we just describe it qualitatively because there's benefits and there's costs. By having remote workers, they're not commuting, for example. So that's an environmental benefit. On the other hand, when you look at ESG, and we'll talk about this a little bit more, but ESG is a very broad look at the operations of a company and the risk on constituents that you don't normally think of. So you would normally think, for example, of health and safety on employees because that's required. but are you having impacts on the health and safety of other people? So a good example, we use an Indian outsourcer for some of our billing work. And every year we remotely inspect their facilities as part of our ESG program and our vendor management. So we have one of the management people in the company. They take a camera and they walk us through the work area during the workday. So we get to see that they have first-rate work environments, that the air conditioning is working, the safety is the same as we have here, so that we can validate that we did this inspection and we're not living in one way and exploiting subcontractors who aren't living the same way. So that's a real world example of this ESG program and how it flows down.
Right. Thank you.
Is there a point in time or period of time or one? That's measured.
What's the periodicity of reporting that we have to do for ESG? And for us, we're on an annual basis. So we report to everybody calendar years and my.
Measure a month, measure one day, weekends, or
I'm sorry, measure what?
period of time? You guys-
Oh, like the evidence that's collected in support of an audit.
Will you be somewhere
Is that
for a
what you mean?
week, for a month, for a quarter?
So yeah, the question is, right, what's the measurement time for this ESG reporting? And really, it's an annual process. So we calculate the carbon we produced, consumed, carbon we produce, energy we consume over the 12-month period. So we calculate statistics on an annual basis. We report on activities throughout the entire year.
Just because I always think like a bad guy, but is there potential to game the system to say, yeah, be here in January and February, you know, our rainy seasons, and then the air is a lot better.
So the question is, what can you game the ESG audits? You can. But if we click down a little bit, because that's perfect timing, actually. So what are the litigation risks? And the first risk is called greenwashing. Because if you lie about your ESG activities, it becomes, with the SEC, there have been notable lawsuits against public companies who have been accused of greenwashing, of lying or misrepresenting about their ESG efforts. Similarly, if we make a false statement to our lenders, we can be in default under our loans. If we misrepresent to customers, we can be accountable legally for that. So it's always possible to lie. It's possible with cybersecurity audits to falsify information as well. If you get caught, it's very bad. And it's not something that we as a company would ever accept. We call our activities the way they are, and we put a lot of time and effort into making them compliant. Some of them we put more effort into than others. For example, we don't control the light bulbs, we don't control electricity, so we can work with our landlords, but there's only so much we can do for that. You had a question.
Expectation on the audits also the expectation for you to drive it all, own the whole program and get more.
Yeah, so the question is, are we managing to pass an audit, or are we managing for broader social issues? And we're managing for broader social issues.
That's or is that Georgia? Like, is that normal? Is that coming to new trends?
So this is a great question. Yeah, awesome. So what portion of ESG falls on the typical CISO? Because I wear many hats, but for somebody who's just a CISO or their department, ESG has a There is a cybersecurity aspect of ESG, and that's what we're talking about here. I'm giving you the background on what ESG is. Let me finish giving you the background, because that's the issue for us, is as cybersecurity professionals, what does this all mean and what's the context? So give me like 5 more minutes and we'll get there, because that's the takeaway that I want you all to take out of this. So you can see, I just gave you some links to some of the more popular ESG frameworks, but there's not general acceptance. And you can see you've got the UN, you've got the World Economic Forum, you've got very well-respected organizations who have not come to agreement with each other on the frameworks. So when you develop an ESG program, you're typically looking at many of them to pick and choose. And I would contrast that with our own approach to cybersecurity, where we have standardized on NIST. And for those healthcare organizations, the HITECH Act, which amends HIPAA, gives a real important reason to pick NIST, which is it's one of the articulated, reasonable security procedures that end up being a partial defense if you have a HIPAA security violation. So you won't be penalized as badly. Your individuals may not get prosecuted individually. So there are reasons to standardize on NIST frameworks, and that's what we've done because we're in healthcare. So the Secure Software Development Framework, the NIST AI Risk Management Framework. So not just the cybersecurity framework, but many of the NIST frameworks we use for that reason. A little bit farther.
But just one quick question, if I could. Is greenwashing a term specifically for ESG?
It is. Greenwashing, well, so while it's ESG, it really refers to any lawsuit that is accusing a company of misrepresenting their activities related to ESG. Because even when you're not obligated to make a statement, let's say you just put on your website, we are the best ESG focused company in the world. We don't even care about profit. All we do is spend money to help the world, and it's a lie. Well, there are lots of mechanisms to hold that company accountable. The FTC, state regulators, and consumers, or if you're a B2B company, your customers all have actions against you based on that false statement. So that's greenwashing, and it's been more and more of an issue because you have public interest groups that review, for example, SEC filings, and they look for bombastic statements that they can prove are not true. And so then they take action themselves.
With the current backlash against everything DEI, is there also a backlash against?
So the question is, with the current backlash at the federal government level and politics in the US against DEI, you know that President Trump has signed certain executive orders and rescinded, like he rescinded Executive Order 11246, which has been around since 1964 and is what formed the basis of the affirmative action planning function in federal contracting, and he rescinded that. So there are consequences that are occurring, but first, that's only the US, so the rest of the world isn't changing it. But you've seen that it's a big debate among companies. Some companies are saying, no, this is a broader concern that we have. And then there are some companies that are backing off. And unfortunately, I think it is an area of debate and not one that I want to make the focus here, because I understand that people may differ on that, but there's still obligations that exist regardless. So that's what I want you to take away, is that you can't now just ignore these things. One good example, the federal legal requirements for affirmative action planning for veterans, for Vietnam veterans, and for disabled people are still in existence. And that's still the law. So it gets very complicated as you really parse through what's still legally required and what's legally prohibited. And I think lawyers are still digesting that now. So now these are the aspects. So I wanted to just give you a breakdown of what does E, S, and G refer to. So E is, I think, intuitive. It's just a breakdown of a company's impact on the environment, carbon emissions, waste, water, deforestation. So it's downstream consequences too. Are you buying recycled paper or are you buying non-recycled paper? Are you buying things that are farmed or developed in ways that are you living cleaner because you're imposing more problems on other areas, other regions, or are you really thinking through how to make life better for what you're doing? Question.
So if I was a good penny pincher for the company, I'd want to do this around November, December. That way a lot of my employees are on vacations, very low, producing time of the year. Does that make sense?
So the question is, can you game this by just being a good corporate citizen in November?
No. Having my organization audited.
So the audit,
Those months when I have less employees, less movement.
no,
less
because
everything.
again, so the question is, what does really an ESG audit look like? Because a cybersecurity audit is often just a point in time. Now, for us, that point in time is typically 6 months or a year. So even for us, when we're providing evidence of compliance, it's not a point in time, it's a period of time. So that's where I'm struggling a little bit. But with ESG, we are reporting annualized statistics. So our carbon consumption is calculated on a full 12-month basis, right? Perfect. And again, for the environmental in particular, the obligations are to look downstream and look at your supply chain. Social is looking at how a company treats people, which for this regard does include employees and considers a different aspect of HR. Just like when we get to governance, we're going to talk about these are all different perspectives on typical corporate functions. And so when you look at social, human rights, are you contracting with people who are using slave labor, using prison labor, right? Things that you're asked to really pay attention to, and we do. We look at our entire supply chain for that. We make people represent that they're not using slave labor, that they're not using child labor. So these things do matter. Diversity and inclusion is part of social. And again, as I've said, there are certain legal changes, but there is still a broad range of diversity and inclusion efforts that are lawful. And I can say that we're not backing off of those as a company. And I think you'll find that many companies are going to still be committed to a fair and inclusive environment. Health and safety is something else. California, we have very aggressive reporting on health and safety, far more than many other states. But our ESG audit goes through that every year. We look at statistics on injuries and training and prevention activities. So that's part of it. Non-discrimination, of course, human capital management, privacy, and data protection. Privacy has become a very big social issue around the world. And you know that from a GDPR perspective, security is an aspect of privacy. So the fact that security is also an aspect of ESG, it's not any different. That security we look at from the bottom up as its own discipline, but when we put it into a real world context, it fits into other things, right? Financially, it's part of your budgeting, but in terms of regulation, security is part of privacy in most of the world. In the US, HIPAA has a privacy rule and a security rule, and we've tended to bifurcate those, but the California CPA looks at them together. California CPA has security requirements. So you're looking at, again, that world coming together, and some companies do that through a lens of their ESG program. Some people do it through their privacy program. It's the same set of concerns. And governance, again, how a company is run. So we've talked about that, director independence, board diversity, compensation, bribery, corruption. So a lot of different aspects. Now, what you've all been waiting for, we get to the points on cybersecurity as an ESG concern. And so, yeah, investors and stakeholders are really driving this as much as anybody else. And it really starts from a place that's very common for cybersecurity professionals to think about. If we don't do our jobs, then the value of the organization is destroyed, because sooner or later, someone will compromise your system or your data, and that can be fatal to you, to your customers, to their data, and to your own careers. So
Sorry,
it's okay.
I think everybody can see what's in the chat.
And so we already talked about privacy and its perspective on cybersecurity. So another, privacy is a very big concern of ESG, again, because of the broader issues. Company has data on people. Some of those people may have no connection themselves to your company. You got it from other companies, you got it from other sources, and that's why you have privacy laws now saying, okay, but you're still regulated in what you can do with it. And if you are careless about security, it defeats the very protections that privacy law is trying to accomplish. So ESG professionals see ESG as the top-down direction and oversight for cybersecurity. So forget about the rest of this now. I've given you what the term and the discipline looks at, which is very broad. But now bringing it into our world of cybersecurity, we look at cybersecurity generally from a bottom up, that we have tactics and techniques that we use to protect our organization from having our security violated. But when you look at cybersecurity from the top down, the question is, what are the risks? The risks to the organization, the risks to other stakeholders. And that's what ESG is bringing to cybersecurity. So whether it's a formal ESG program, or whether it's your privacy program, or whether it is just your board of directors, because boards of directors have to address the cybersecurity risk. Many state laws require that now, and normal state liability laws put liability personally on members of a board of directors for their failure to act reasonably, to take the proper oversight of a company. And now that oversight includes cybersecurity. So as soon as a board is looking at cybersecurity, that's very different than the perspective that we bring to that. And what the whole point of this discussion is that as cybersecurity professionals, we need to resonate with that, because what you're doing, how you do it, how you grow in your career and learn how to communicate to others has to be from this lens also. You have to understand the bottom up. That's what certifications help you do, experience and learning does, but you also have to appreciate the top down. And the CISM, to a good extent, covers that, right? It takes you through thinking more broadly about that impact. And I would see this as moving the step beyond the CISM's body of knowledge and really thinking through what are shareholders concerned about? What's the board concerned about? What are regulators concerned about? And what is the public concerned about with respect to cybersecurity? The rest of ESG is good for you to know, and it may impact you, but this is the direct impact on us that we're talking about here. So I've given you some links rather than belabor it myself, but the World Economic Forum says cybersecurity should just be ESG, that nothing else matters, because the perspective on cyber is not the components of security. It's no different than any other corporate matter. It's the risk on a global perspective. What's the risk to you of the bad things that could happen, and are you properly addressing them? You've got Price Waterhouse talking about building trust with ESG and cybersecurity. JP Morgan Why is cybersecurity important to ESG? So Harvard Law School, you've got lots of lawyers and economists and consultants all saying the same thing from their perspective, that the cybersecurity focus on the tactics and techniques and tools that we use to keep things safe have to be put into a broader context in order to make the right decisions, budgeting, priorities. And that means that it goes beyond cybersecurity professionals. So I meet on a quarterly basis with the audit committee of our board. We have a security program that we set every year. And I set that program first by working with my two teams, my cybersecurity team and my InfoSec team, but then I socialize it with all the executives. So everybody understands what we're committing to for the year and what that means for each one of them. And then I report on our progress against that on a monthly basis to our executives and a quarterly basis to the board. And that's driven by my understanding of how to translate the technical issues that we deal with into the broad issues, the language that board members and the public use in terms of risk and privacy and the impacts broadly, cyber insurance. And so that's what the purpose of this talk is just to show you guys that there's a dimension out there that some of you may just not have thought of, but as your career grows, this is a career enhancing thing for you to learn to speak these other languages and look at the broader concerns that impact what you're doing and learning to reach out to your legal department, to privacy, to your ESG if you have it, and resonate with their concerns, incorporate them into your planning and your activities, and show how that's working. And that's the path to becoming CISO or even the position above CISO.
Yeah.
And I down a little bit more.
Oh, sure.
So monitoring, reporting. So obviously, one of the notions of cybersecurity is what you're not monitoring and reporting, you're not really doing, right? So that's just a common approach. And so in ESG, it means that we're doing different monitoring and reporting, right? If you're accepting that ESG brings this broader context, maybe you care more about the number of DSARs you get, the data subject access requests. If you have lots of people asking to rectify their data, maybe you have a data problem that you need to deal with. Looking more broadly at the cyber activities and putting them into this broader context. One of the broader contexts in the US, as I said, is SEC reporting on cyber incidents. When you have to report as a public company on an incident, when they say incidents, they mean breaches. One of the differences in different legal regimes, right? In HIPAA, an incident is not a breach. A breach is an incident that results in an exposure. But for this purpose, the incidents are really occurrences that cause damages. And
The material.
yeah, right. And so this one link, the 100 days of cybersecurity incident reporting, is a great thing for you guys to look at, because a law firm went through and extracted out, and a leading law firm extracted out, here's how companies are reporting when they've had cybersecurity incidents. And it shows you where your role fits into that broader picture, because shareholders read that, and the SEC reads it, and litigation arises over it, and insurance claims are made on it. And that's the broader world that all of this is filtering up to. We also look at corporate websites, because you're going to report significant incidents on your own website. The law is going to require that, but also your survival as a company is. And I just gave you one that I thought was really interesting. This River Region Cardiology healthcare provider that had a very significant breach. And you can see that companies really struggle with how do we communicate that, which then brings in a whole new group of corporate thinkers. You've got your crisis management people, you have PR and marketing. Your president may not want to make this communication, and your legal and regulatory people are going to say, no, you have to. And so then you, as you move up in your careers, may be the people who are now advising on how to phrase what really happened. Something as simple as, do you call it an incident or do you call it a breach? Do you talk about the word damages? Things that aren't really, we could talk about risk, we can talk about impact, but damages is a legal word that has a magic connotation. And so learning the language that other stakeholders in our activities really matters and helps your career. I gave you another great summary from another great law firm on the 10K, which are the quarterly reports that are filed with the SEC, showing you how companies are reporting their security efforts. So not incidents, but just how they report on the activities that they take. And I would encourage all of you who are ambitious to move up, that read things like that to understand this is where my work fits in to this broader corporate perspective, so that you can then figure out how to communicate in that dimension, how to learn how other people see it, because it's very different how we as cybersecurity professionals see this. So the impact then on us as cybersecurity professionals, this growing importance of cybersecurity in ESG is different than the debate going on about diversity or climate change. There really isn't a debate that cybersecurity is important, that privacy is important. Nobody really stands up and says, we don't care if the data we have is compromised. They do, because even if they don't care, you're out of business. If you look at the money that big companies have incurred, Aetna, for example, a terrifying liability. 50 states AGs sued them. The federal government sued them. Plaintiffs sued them. They wound up agreeing to something like $250 million of extra security expenditures just to assuage the allegations. So big impacts that the more we understand this, the more we can incorporate this into our own career. So being aware of ESG requirements and thinking about what we do from the perspective of other people. Consumers is an easy one to think about. When we do our corporate work, we may not be thinking about how consumers are viewing it. Should we, for example, have a website that talks about what we do? But if we talk about it too aggressively, does that put a target on us?
Right.
You wouldn't want a website that says, we guarantee that no one can ever breach our security. I figure it'll take a day for the world to attack you, right? So you have this constant debate about who do you communicate what at what level of detail. We have customers all the time who, in root cause analyses, they want the absolute most granular detail, and we won't give it to them because we say, we found this vulnerability and we patched it, but they want to know exactly what went on. And we're like, it could still be used for malicious work. We don't know how you store this. We don't share it on that level. And you have that type of decision-making all the time, which I would argue is an ESG type of thinking, because you have the facts, but now you have different constituencies and stakeholders, and how you express those facts and what you choose to filter to them really matter. So the final thing that I put here, and I think that this is really important, if ESG cares about cybersecurity, then ESG professionals are being held accountable. And what does that mean? It means that you may get involved in parsing out responsibility. RACI charts are something that we should all get involved in, and understanding. I've had ESG people tell me they should run cybersecurity. And I've said no, because there's a technical aspect that should be run by technical people. The ESG people, in my opinion, bring the focus on how to communicate to different constituencies that cybersecurity professionals may not be experienced in communicating to. But it's really important for you to work out with the various parts of your company who is responsible for what. And where that rubber meets the road is when an incident happens. Because if you don't have all of this planned out in advance, you can't really make peace once you have a breach, right? At that point, everybody's fighting and panicking and pointing fingers at each other. And so you really have to have these roles in a RACI chart in your incident response plan so that when the ESG people say, oh my God, we have to communicate, and the lawyers say, don't communicate, and the regulatory people say, but we have Europe, you have to have a process of working this all out while people are working 24 hours a day to deal with it. So the final question. So does your organization's cybersecurity program consider these stakeholders? So whether you consider it ESG or not, does your cybersecurity program consider the interests of any of these parties? Some people are saying yes. Some people are even saying no, they don't at all. And that's what I'm talking about in terms of incorporating ESG thinking into our activities. This matters. Thinking about consumers, investors. What are we going to report to our owners and when? So the board is one thing, and you have an obligation to report to your board. But when do you start reporting to your biggest customer? When do you report to your, if you have a union, when do you get a union involved, right? All the different stakeholders, and having this thought out in advance is very important. And I think that's it. Let's go down a little bit more. So conclusion, takeaways. ESG globally is continuing to, in its growth and importance, but particularly for cyber, where privacy is becoming more important around the world, whether you call it ESG or you just see it as other disciplines that impact us. It starts with privacy, AI regulation, which is now a separate regulation around the world. So this is going to continue to impact cybersecurity. Collaborating with other professionals becomes more important for us so that the plans you have, the steps you're taking, the activities, we communicate them in advance so that there is no finger pointing after the fact. If somebody wants to have input, let them have input at the planning stage. The rear view mirror after you've had an incident is not the time for somebody to say, well, I wish you had done this. You need to get them involved up front because there's money trade-offs and time trade-offs and resources that you have to address if you do it properly. Adapting our management to ESG expectations, again, even just in communicating and learning how to communicate it and having low role clarity is important. And that's the presentation. So before I hand it off to Dave, who's going to show whoever still has time that the ISACA has created a framework that can be used to bridge this gap. Because right now, there isn't really a clear agreement on frameworks for cybersecurity as an ESG type concern. But before Dave takes the command, are there any final questions?
So it seems like your company has embraced the idea of ESG, which is awesome. But across the industry, have you noticed more board of directors veering towards like, oh, they're checkboxes, let's check it, call it a day, or are you seeing more companies embrace it?
Yeah, it's a great question, which is to what extent do we see companies really embracing ESG versus just checking the box? I can say this, in cybersecurity, no right-thinking person just checks the box. And so privacy, AI regulation, and security has a public aspect to it that's not going away and isn't going to be diminished. I think that there's a debate in the US about climate reporting. In Europe, it's the law. And the law with significant financial penalties for failing to comply. Much of the world is following the EU, not following the US. That's similar with AI. The EU AI Act is it's ironic. When I started as an attorney, US really led. HIPAA was really an earth-shaking piece of litigation when it first came out, legislation. But we lagged, and Europe has really taken over because they're able to implement laws, and really the paralysis in our federal government means that we don't solve legal and business problems in a consistent way. So we have 50 states now promulgating privacy laws that often conflict with each other. And there's been pressure for a federal privacy law, but it hasn't happened. So in the US, there is more of a debate about these issues, but in the rest of the world, there really is not. And if you check the box because in the US you think you can get away with it, that's great until you wake up with European customers, with European business. I'll give you a great example. One of our large hospital customers, they made us sign a DPA, a data privacy addendum. And I really pushed back. You're in the US, why? They go, we have a London office. And so we aggressively source patients in Europe to come to the US, making us, meaning them, directly liable to comply with European law. Therefore, they have to have us comply because their medical procedures are handling the data of European citizens that they've got from Europe. So the complexity of the world is such that executives may think that they can avoid this, and they can avoid some of it, but they can't avoid the parts that affect us here, which was the point of this discussion, is that since we're not directly involved here in calculating carbon, as an example, we can listen to the debate all day long about carbon reporting, but the issue of reporting to the SEC for a public company on cybersecurity, that's not in debate. And shareholders care because if we don't handle cybersecurity properly, the shareholder is not getting what they think they're buying. Kind of like a car without brakes. When you find out that there's no brakes on the car, somebody gets hurt and then somebody pays. So really it's liability risk that drives this now and will continue to drive it from a cyber perspective.
There is a question.
Sure.
That Michael had posted online. If you have any recommendations for closer training materials. ESG.
So what I'll do is, what's the easiest way? Can I send you materials and maybe at the next meeting you could post it, or what's the easiest way to get everybody that?
Probably easiest way is for me to get it from you. And what I'll do is the goal is to get the recording and a version of this up online this weekend. So I can do that. And then if I can get an updated copy that has that added.
Oh, okay.
We can update that online.
Awesome.
And then circle back for next month.
Perfect.
Remind and let everybody know. I know we're kind of overtime and whatnot, but and totally appreciate everybody. This is fantastic.
Thank you. Appreciate everybody attending.
Yeah, what I would love to do, and I didn't think about it until about 20 minutes ago, is if we could later this year do another presentation where we do a little bit deeper of a dive into the digital ISACA's digital trust system.
Yeah.
And then we could align it and you could share this applies here, this, and you can identify where it's coming up short. And I think that could be something real educational for everybody. We could continue to play it forward.
Excellent. Excellent.
Okay.
Yeah. Well, thank you all very much. Really appreciate you all being here and being part of this. Thank you. And thank you, everybody there.
Thanks, Bill.
One thing I will share with everybody, so you get this, but I do have a copy and I'll add this to the download section of the recording. It is a PDF that comes directly. Is anybody here familiar with ISACA's digital trust ecosystem framework? Right on. Same place I was a year ago. Is anybody here familiar with COVID? Okay. Okay. Yeah. Okay, so you know how that is more of a business optimization framework versus thinking NIST or CIS, like a cybersecurity framework. Well, the digital trust ecosystem framework is kind of the next evolution of COVID. It's not a security framework. It's designed to take into consideration. The best way I can say it is, a long time ago, we used to not go online to go do business. And we would physically go somewhere, we would meet somebody. And over time, we could actually learn if you trust this person and build a relationship. And let that be, and that person does right by you, so you refer someone else to that person. And that trust gets built. This is designed to try and help create a model of how you can build trust in how you run your organization. And it is it's a model that allows it to be quantifiable. So you can go through it, an organization can adhere to it and be able to build and play forward. What happened with Marty and I a lot was, as we were talking about this was one of the closest things we could find to ESG, but they don't correlate 1 to 1. And so just to share with everybody, I'll share this and then I'll share the flyer. It's the framework itself is built on people, organization, and technology and process. Then it becomes, then you have the bars that connect the circles of how, like if you look at where does technology integrate with an organization, you look at what is the technical architecture that we have. Between people in the organization, that's where culture can fall. And human factors between people and technology. So in a future one, we'll go into this deeper, but this model is designed to be that way. And then it'll get into individual controls of culture, emergence, enabling support, and those other things that connect those 4 pillars of the framework. So I'll make this, like I said, this will become available. If anybody's got questions, feel free to reach out, but we'll do a future workshop on that and be happy to share that with everybody. So, thank you.